In this video, I'm going to talk about good and evil, communism, Buddhism, the Watchmen movie, and why I think Sam Harris is wrong and Nietzsche is right about what our highest objective should be for the human species. The movie and graphic novel Watchmen has some illustrative examples of some of the things that I want to talk about here. So, spoiler alerts if you haven't seen it, but the main plot point is that Ozymandias, this character Ozymandias, he engineers this huge attack, this false flag, killing millions of people, and he frames Dr. Manhattan, this other character, as the perpetrator of this attack. But he does this for a reason. He does it because the world is on the brink of nuclear war. This is set in the Cold War in an alternate sort of timeline. And the world's on the brink of nuclear war. Ozymandias sees that this is going to happen, the war is going to happen. So he frames Dr. Manhattan, and he unifies the world against a common enemy, namely Dr. Manhattan. And it works. He prevents, there's a newfound peace, nuclear war is prevented, and the world is saved, right? Now, this other character, Rorschach, he discovers this truth, he discovers the plot, and he plans to expose the truth, but Dr. Manhattan actually, even though he's the one being framed, he's being blamed for all of this, he sees that Ozymandias is kind of right. That if Rorschach is allowed to go and tell the truth to the people, it would cancel this newfound peace. And all these people would have died for nothing, right? So Manhattan actually, somewhat reluctantly, vaporizes. He kills Rorschach because Rorschach is like, no, I'm going to tell them the truth. A peace that is based on lies is not okay. It's not worth it. Manhattan decides that Ozymandias is kind of right, kills Rorschach, and leaves Earth. Now, this idea of this utilitarian, consequentialist kind of approach taken by Ozymandias is interesting, and you can see his argument, right? It kind of makes sense. Like, if we're really on the brink of nuclear war, which would kill billions of people, kind of reset the whole Earth, and we can prevent it by killing a few million, it's like if your framework is that you're just going to do calculations and kind of maximize the number of lives that are lived or whatever, which I'll talk about later, because I don't think that's a good idea. But if you think that way, it kind of makes sense. On the other hand, we have Rorschach. He has a deontological ethics, which is the strict following of certain rules. For him, it's not just about this calculation, maximizing lives saved, whatever. For him, it's like, you have to tell the truth. There's certain rules that we just have to follow. We have to do the right thing, right? And you can see the point there too. It's not hard to imagine hypotheticals where, you could save 100 lives if you do some horrible thing to one person. For most people, for a lot of people, there's a line where maybe you would have that person sacrifice to save 100 in like a not super painful way. But if you get into you would have to torture that single person and blah, 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 do awful things. For a lot of people, it's like too much. It's too far, and I'm not going to do it. If we have to damn the whole species to annihilation, maybe in certain situations, that's what we do. If the only other option is to commit some awful, horrible thing, which would just be too horrible to bear, and which would also warp our own perspective of ourselves, and it would kind of sour the rest of the timeline, and it would deform us, right? So anyway, Rorschach has a point too. But this idea that Ozymandias is kind of illustrating here it's very interesting, and it's very old too. The basic idea that he has here is the idea of a noble lie, or some evil deed which produces good, a great deal of good. And this idea of a noble lie, of course, is very old. This goes back to Plato, where Plato proposed, or he gave this example of this positive eugenics program where you would have this system which looks like a random lottery, which would pair people up to produce offspring. But in reality, it wouldn't be random. You would be selecting the people and pairing them based on their genetics and intelligence and health. So you would pair up the healthiest, best people, and they would produce good offspring, and that would be a good kind of, it would be a benefit to all of mankind. And very interesting side note, which I'll talk about in future videos, I think, is that some people, namely a philosopher called Jason Giorgiani, some people believe that Plato's philosophy itself was a noble lie, and that he actually willingly, knowingly sort of designed a lot of his philosophy so that it would facilitate the development and sophistication of the Greek mind, but that he didn't actually believe it to be true, per se. He constructed it, and he gave the Greeks something that they could digest and understand and relate to. He kind of, he took maybe his real beliefs, which were too much to handle for the people at that time, and he gave them a softer version, which would lead them eventually in some positive direction, right? And an extremely interesting notion is to imagine that that could be true, not just for Plato as philosophy, that could also be true for religions, for more philosophies in general, right? So you could imagine an entire religion being designed, and maybe it contains certain truths. Surely it has to contain a whole bunch of truths. But you could also design a religion to facilitate the development, the sophistication, the civilization of a group of people, right? So entire religions, some of the major religions of the world, could be this. They could be these designed things to help develop the mind of the people and so on, but they could be entirely false. So anyway, one of the dangers of this way of thinking, and there are many, but one of the dangers is that your calculations can be wrong. So in the case of Ozymandias, he calculates that he'll have to kill a few million people and it will achieve world peace. Well, your calculation could also just be wrong. Like in the movie, it's implied that he was right because world peace is achieved. But in reality, we have these attempts being made through the 20th century, for example, in communism, where there was this imagined utopia, this end state, and the kind of Ozymandias calculation was made like, hey, if we have to sacrifice some people, it's worth it, right? But the sacrifices were made, millions of people were killed, and it didn't work. Like the desired utopian end state wasn't actually reached. So that's one of the primary dangers with this way of thinking is you're trying to project into the future, and that's obviously very hard to do, and it's very complicated, right? So the evolution of our ethical thinking has sort of evolved from being similar to that of Rorschach, a sort of deontological ethics, to that of Ozymandias, a more consequentialist utilitarian perspective. At least I would argue that the Western sort of perspective is much more in this camp than it is in the deontological camp. And, I think the reason for that is that what's happened is that we've evolved from being very Christian to obviously being much less Christian. We're much more secular now. And in the Christian, framework, in that cosmos, if you believe you live in this reality where there's an omniscient, omnipotent God, the greatest being that could ever be, etc., if that being, you believe that being exists, and he's giving you rules to follow, you should probably follow them, right? It kind of makes sense to follow those rules. But then we stopped believing this. Nietzsche declared God to be dead, and that this would cause untold carnage and death, but perhaps would be worth the price if we learned something from it. But this shifted to we no longer believe there to be this omniscient, omnipotent being at the top giving us rules. So then we started to question all of the rules, and all of the rules become flexible. They become suggestions, right? We realize that we don't have this being at the top of our pyramid. Man can ascend to that highest perch the throne, and can start to make these decisions that are very consequential, right? Like, well, maybe, we might need to sacrifice 10 million people or 20 million people or whatever if it achieves our objective, because we have this great objective and it's worth it. So yeah, let's just do it, right? Like, this evolution opens up the door for that kind of super high level, extremely consequentialist thinking. And so obviously this is an argument against this consequentialist thinking, but I think this is clearly the extreme case, right? You can make more reasonable arguments and examples and hypotheticals for some consequentialist thinking. And I think Sam Harris does a good job of this. And I think he's a good representation of basically the Western secular worldview, or at least a version of it. So Sam Harris will often say that, if you have some terrorist, a hypothetical situation, you have some terrorist, he has the location of some bomb, it's going to go off in like 20 minutes or whatever. It's in a school, it's going to kill a bunch of people. You can torture him and potentially get him to talk and save those people. Sam Harris would say, you do it. Torture him. Like, just do it. And, I'd probably agree with that. Like, it's pretty easy to make that, at least in this hypothetical, right? It's pretty easy to make that argument. What happens in communism is this is taken to an extreme level with these huge projections of utopia, and it becomes extremely bloody. Now, the reason that Sam is okay with that trade-off, he's okay with inflicting some pain and torture on the terrorist in order to save all of the children, is that Sam has a bit of a consequentialist perspective, where he wants to see more well-being exist in the world and less suffering, but he's okay with introducing a little suffering if we can reasonably project that it's going to have a good outcome, that it's going to prevent this literal bomb of suffering from going off somewhere else, right? So, and I would probably agree with him there. I think there's situations where consequentialist thinking makes a lot of sense. But where I disagree with Sam is in his higher objective that he is kind of pursuing. Because, okay, there's two different things here, right? There's your higher objective, and then there's the way in which you think we should get there, and the little deviations that are tolerable in getting there, right? So you may have as your highest objective the maximization of well-being, the reduction of suffering, which I think is what Sam has as his highest objective. And then you have the separate question of, okay, what is tolerable to achieve that? For Sam, you can take little deviations where you increase suffering actually in little local areas, actually going against your higher goal, right? But you can increase the suffering in little local situations if it's going to reasonably prevent a whole bunch of suffering a little bit down the road, right? And you can make an argument for that. It's logical. It makes sense. You could even have the same objective, right? Maximization of well-being, but you could take a more deontological approach, and you could believe, no, what we should do to achieve the goal is to follow rules and be very pacifist, very peaceful, and be like Buddhists, right? I think the Buddhist kind of prescription is basically that we should follow the rules, and we should meditate, and we should just become more present and aware, and we'll see more of this truth. But we should be pacifist, and probably a little less of. We should probably do a little less of this kind of civilizational engineering and these things that Sam is kind of pointing to, right? But I want to actually argue against that highest objective because, as I said, I think, I can sympathize with the utilitarian approach to your objective, but I think the objective that Sam has is actually not really the right one, or there's something wrong with it, I think. And again, his highest objective is that we should reduce suffering and increase well-being. And I've reduced this to an equation here, which I don't know if it's actually useful, but if you imagine all of the well-being of all of the people over time, it's a function of time because people have different lifespans, etc. We could sum up all of those people, all of their well-being over time, and integrate that over all of time. So we're like adding up all of the well-being of all of the people, both now and who will exist into the future, over their lifetimes, extending all the way out into infinity. And if we maximize that, that would be good. This is like the North Star of the, in a sense, I think this is the North Star of like the rationalist, kind of Western secular people of that perspective. And I think Sam is a good avatar of this perspective. But this is the equation. So we're trying to make the green arrows bigger and the red ones smaller, make them turn green, where these represent suffering and these are well-being. And, you know, it makes some sense. Given this perspective, though, you can imagine there's different scales of like the problems that you can have here. In the atheist example, it's like pretty clear. It's not that hard to endorse such a thing. But then, as I mentioned, on the extreme end, you have communism. You have this, we're here, there's suffering, etc. There's this imagined utopia, this huge vision, this grand plan, which would involve a massive transformation of society. And to get there, we have to make some of these arrows go very red. We have to maybe kill some people. And so, you know, that is one of the failure cases of this thinking, as I mentioned. But anyway, I think this whole objective is itself actually not quite right. And I mean, it's not a terrible objective, right? Like well-being is pretty nice. Like needless suffering, there seems to be a point where I'm not sure what you're getting out of it. But I think this is, it's wrong as a highest objective. There's something deeply wrong about it. Because, okay, here's a good counterexample to this objective. So if you imagine the Wireheading scenario, which you've probably heard of, where imagine we have a way to synthetically induce a state of total bliss and peace and pleasure, whatever. So maybe with Neuralink, we discover a way to stimulate certain regions of the brain and achieve like bliss forever, you know? And you could imagine then, this would be a really good maximization of this equation. You get a bunch of people with Neuralink, they achieve this state of bliss, you give them a pod where they get intravenous food, whatever, and they live that way for the rest of their lives. You know, this would maximize that equation. It would be this immense well-being. But it's pretty clear that this is ugly, right? It's like cringe. It's like embarrassing. You know, if you imagined your child, your son or daughter in the future, they sign up for this and they just stay in it. Years go by. They don't do anything. They don't have a life, but they're very, very happy. They're very peaceful. Maybe they unplug once in a while for Thanksgiving and they show up and they're like, yeah, this is great. I mean, I can't wait to get back in there, but it's just great. You guys should try it. It's like, no, it's cringe. It's bad. It's shameful, right? From the interior subjective experience, it's perhaps great. Just bliss. Like, what's better? But you zoom out and you kind of step out of yourself, or you imagine all of mankind and you see them doing this. You see this vision of these fields of pods, and it's ugly. And surely, one of my intuitions is I think surely when you're considering these highest objectives, one of the things you should factor in is not just the subjective feeling and experience of an individual kind of in this atomic small sense, but you should consider the big picture, right? What do we look like from the outside? Are we this cringe, gross, like sad failure, or are we something amazing? And, you know, this is obviously a specific kind of extreme example, but even if you consider the more natural path that the Buddhists prescribe, where you pursue this greater awareness and understanding and presence, and you notice your mind, and you realize that the suffering kind of fades away if I understand that desire is creating the suffering, and I can just watch this desire like show up and then go away, and eventually I become free. This whole path, it may result in the cessation of suffering, but I think it also results in the cessation of, action and drama and greatness and ambition and all of those amazing things. And Nietzsche understood this very well. He understood that suffering is actually an engine of greatness and growth and insight. That, if you were to get rid of suffering, that would be a terrible tragedy, actually. It might feel really nice. I'm sure it would. Suffering's not pleasant by definition, but you lose a lot. In fact, you might lose everything if you do that. So Nietzsche understood this perspective. It's not that the Buddhists are wrong. I mean, I think they're brilliant, and they've discovered deep truths about human subjective experience. And they're not wrong that desire is the root of all suffering. Like, the desire for these things creates the suffering that you don't have those things, and that's certainly true. But Nietzsche's counterpoint to that is that, yes, but suffering is the root of all greatness, right? So the desire creates the suffering, but that suffering drives mankind toward greatness and growth and evolution and all these things, right? So he's not even disagreeing with much of what the Buddhists are teaching, only in their higher kind of like final prescription and objective, which is where I agree with Nietzsche. So, yeah, if we all follow Buddha, we may eliminate suffering, but we may also eliminate ourselves. And here's a quote from Nietzsche where he explains this a little bit. He says, "You want, if possible, and there is no more insane, if possible, to abolish suffering. And it really seems that we would rather have it higher and worse than ever. Well-being as you understand it, that is no goal. That seems to us an end, a state that soon makes man ridiculous and contemptible, that makes his destruction desirable. The discipline of suffering, of great suffering, do you not know that only this discipline has created all enhancements of man so far?" Right? So he's saying that suffering, in fact, great suffering, has been the source, the engine of all of the good stuff, all of the enhancements, all of the evolution and growth of mankind. So, yeah, Nietzsche thought we should strive upward and toward self-overcoming. And yeah, the other thing I'll say is that I think this is a little bit analogous, in my opinion, to the growth and development of a person, where I think we are moving from a more adolescent childhood state of mankind, in a certain sense, where we've been living under the rule of our Father, right? God the Father, the great Father, the Father of all fathers, right? We've been living under that rule for a long time. We've been living in that house, like a kid living in the house of his father, right? The father has this extreme authority, and he has to be kind of you just have to obey. You might not understand the rules, but you should just obey them. And that makes sense when you're at a certain stage of development. But as you develop further, you should and must reach the state, not the state, but you should reach the state where you become your own person, your own man, your own woman, where you no longer simply follow the rules of your father, where you leave home, right? And that is where we are, I believe. We are here, not here. We are moving in this direction. And our first venture out into the great outdoors was, in fact, pretty terrifying because it was a whole bunch of this stuff. And, a lot of people now want to return home, right? There's this rise, this renaissance, this rebirth of Christianity, or just whatever invigoration. And a lot of people are like, yeah, let's go back to that. Let's go back under the rule of the Great Father. And that's clearly a better option than what we've seen so far in the 20th century with communism, etc. But I think we can't go back. We should not go back. We need to do as Nietzsche thought we should do, which is become our own individual, chart our own destiny, chart our own course, right? We need to step out into the cold and dangerous world, and it is cold and dangerous, but that is not justification for staying indoors, right? And I'm certainly not advocating for communism by any means. I think it's a completely ridiculous and insane and awful framework and idea. I'm just advocating that we do not go back into and under into a religious system to chart our destiny. We have to chart our destiny. And yeah, we should not go back inside, nor should we go sit under a tree, as much as I think the Buddhists are right about many, many things, and they have deep insights. And, well-being's nice. It's good. But as the highest objective, nah. We don't want to just go outside and sit under a tree. We should go on a great adventure. We should go out into the fray and have our great adventure. So, yeah, I mean, one of my highest values is that of growth and evolution, right? I mentioned this in a previous video, but I think, man doesn't have a fixed nature. This is something that philosopher Giorgiani talks about as well. Man does not have a fixed nature. The only nature that man really has is evolution. That's like our true essence, right? That's our true kernel of who we are, is that we evolve and grow and we continue to advance more. And, we're not like the other animals, right? Like wolves and chipmunks or whatever. They don't really change. And that's fine. Like, they're beautiful, they're wonderful. But they're kind of like, they have their essence and it's sort of eternal, right? It kind of stays the same. We're not like that. If we have an essence, it's an evolution, this continual expression and growth and understanding and this looping back upon ourselves. And that to me is the highest thing that we should achieve. And I'll talk more about that in another video, but that to me makes a lot more sense and is more beautiful and true, etc., than this. So I think we should go on our adventure, and the suffering that we no doubt encounter along the way will fuel this evolution. And that would be a great thing, to evolve into the next stage of mankind.